Let's go ahead and get started. I have just a couple of announcements before Dr. Davis speaks. First of all, if you have any interest in signing up for a small group Bible study on Joshua this fall, then all you need to do is to click that QR code. You can find it on the back of your pew. It's on the little bitty cards that are around. You can use it there. You can actually go on the website or on your app and check that QR code, and it'll take you right in, and you can sign up for whichever Bible study, whatever area you would like to. See, I also want to remind you, yes, well, there they are. Also want to, sorry. So there are the women, there are the men's, and I think that, yes. So the Women's Fall Retreat is coming up, and I believe this is the last week, ladies, that you can sign up for that retreat and mark your spot for it. So I want to encourage you to do that. It's going to be at Lake Junaluska, up near Maggie Valley, up above Asheville this fall. I'm sure the weather's going to be absolutely lovely there. See if I have anything else. Oh, G3, just continue to encourage you as that ministry begins to unfold. We have a number of groups going on this fall, and we're excited already about what God's doing in that. If you have any kind of issue or brokenness in your life that you want to address, let me encourage you to go to the website and check out the G3 page there, where you'll see different kinds of recovery groups, different kinds of support groups, and also different kinds of process groups. And it explains what they are, and it explains the kind of groups that we have going currently, and also gives you an opportunity if there's a particular area there that you would like addressed in the future. We'd love to know about that too, because we have some sense of the kinds of things that we all wrestle with, but we don't know all of those, and we'd love to hear from you if there's a particular area that you would love to have some help in and be able to come alongside some other folks in that journey. So I encourage you to do that as well. I think that's all that I have now, so thank you guys for that. Again, Dr. Davis, it's a wonderful opportunity to have you here. Would you share with us now a little bit about the overview of Joshua and maybe have some fun with us as well?
Well, before I go to the sacred desk, I've told that I'm supposed to do these things with these T-shirts as supposed to trick questions, all right? And so one of them is, if Joshua died in 2021, how old? When would he have been born? No. 1911. Here you go. Okay, now what's the name? What's the name of Joshua's nephew? Pardon? Ah, there it was. We don't know. You're right. Okay. Let's go to the book of Joshua. This is called Jumping into Joshua, and it's kind of drinking from a fire hydrant. Sorry about that, but that's the way these overviews of big books go. Now, You've probably already gotten quite a taste of Joshua because of the Sunday evening preaching and so on. So in a way, some of this may be redundant, but I'm going to come at this with the idea of let's try to get a handle on the whole book, okay? And so we need to make some tracks. So Joshua is a scary book. You read less than half of the book and you find it's filled with characters and items you'd rather avoid. Urban harlots, raging rivers, required surgery, crumbling walls, hot contraband, and lying diplomats. The last are probably not a surprise. After half a book of thrills and fright, Joshua seems to become suddenly sedate. and you wonder if a fanatical but frustrated geography professor didn't get his hands on it. In any case, this is the God-inspired document we're supposed to study. Now, the focus of the book comes in chapter 1, verse 2. The land that is Yahweh, the land that I am giving you. So God is giving Abraham's seed the land he had promised, Genesis 12, 6 and 7, giving his people a home. The Lord is always anxious to prepare a place. Heard that before? For his people. That's what he's doing in Joshua. The more we could say on that, time forbids. Now, there are three major points, three Roman numerals, okay? The first is the dull stuff. It's sort of like a meal here. You know how they punish you when you eat an ordinary meal? You have to have a salad, then you have to have a main course, and then you finally get the dessert. Why they don't reverse that and you get the dessert first, I don't know. But you always have to have the dull stuff first. That's what this is, the dull stuff, all right? Now, this is the factor about studying the book of Joshua, but I think in our terms and in our day, we have to at least touch on it, and I think it's necessary. So one bit of the dull stuff is a matter of history. Not that history's boring, but it's a matter of history taking the book of Joshua as whether it's history or not. Now, here's a contemporary biblical scholar who says, all but the most conservative biblical scholars do agree that Joshua is not history in the sense of an account of what actually happened. This writer also goes on to say when it talks about the wars in Joshua, the portrayal is not historical. While Israel no doubt engaged in some battles for land as its population expanded, it seems to have emerged on previously unsettled hills. What's that scholar saying? All this stuff about a conquest in Joshua, not historical. It's more not a conquest, but a settlement. Israel didn't conquer the land, etc. They oozed into the land, and that sort of thing. This is the whole, all but the most conservative biblical scholars agree that Joshua's not history in the sense of what actually happened, so on. So this is often a contemporary view in much contemporary biblical studies. You run into that. I don't have time to go into detailed response to that. I make one general observation. The problem with that position that Joshua is not really historical, that it's, you see, that their view is that what you read in Joshua is an inflated, exaggerated, juiced up account. The problem with that view is that there's too much restraint in the Joshua narrative to be wild inventions. That is, if the writer or writers wanted to show God's promises fulfilled marvelously, they would have had Joshua camp north and east on the banks of the Euphrates, and he would have subjugated Lebanon and Phoenicia. There would be more stuff included. It would have been far more fantastic than it appears. Why such restraint? You know, because the writer's careful about what he reports. And so on. So that's a general observation, which we just have to leave it go at that. Now, a specific example of a matter of history here. The attack on Jericho in Joshua 6 and so on. Now, the last few years, and you'll read it if you read anything in terms of archaeology about Joshua, they'll often say, because of maybe the last 30 or 40 years, an archaeologist, Kathleen Kenyon, investigated Jericho, and she decided on the basis of certain pottery that she did not find there, if she would have found this special pottery in Jericho in her digs, she would have been able to say it was a late bronze destruction. That is about maybe 1400 BC, when Joshua may have come in. But she didn't find this particular pottery, so she decided that Jericho was destroyed in 1550 BC in the Middle Bronze Age and not in the Late Bronze Age, so that when Joshua and Israel came in 1400, or if you go by the late date, 1250 BC, there was nothing really there in Jericho. And so Jericho, that story is, it's juiced up, and so on. The problem is that about 1990 or so, another archaeologist, Bryant Wood, who works for the Associates for Biblical Research, investigated Jericho, and he found that there was some of that special pottery that she was looking for that was there. Earlier archaeologists had found it, and there was ordinary pottery there in Jericho that dated from the Late Bronze Age. So the fact that it was destroyed in the Late Bronze Age, or about 1400 BC. And so a lot of that has been overturned. But if you just read popular reports of it, you'll often find this, well, there was really nothing there when Israel came through. That's based on, I would say, faulty archaeological conclusions. Now, that's a matter of history. There's more dull stuff. A matter of morality. What do we mean by that? Well, look at chapter 6, verse 21. This is after the attack on Jericho. They enforced the curse of destruction, the herem, on everyone in the city, men and women, young and old, including the oxen, the sheep, and the donkeys, slaughtering them all. And the hue and cry comes up, aha, this is nothing but the oppressors and the oppressed. And Israel, as God's favorite, comes in and crushes these people and so on. Well, what you have to keep in mind there is back off and get out of all the emotion and say, what is the Old Testament's view of the conquest? There are three elements in the Old Testament view of the conquest. Number one, the patience God shows. Genesis 15:16. He said to Abraham that his descendants would not come back for 400 years to the land, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. Genesis 15:16. That is, they're not yet ripe for judgment, but it's about to come. But there's a patience that God shows, and he delays the judgment to come on those inhabitants of the land. So the patience God shows, you have to keep that in mind. Number two, the depravity God abhors. Leviticus 18, for example. The depravity God abhors. In Leviticus 18, Yahweh said that Israel must be different. They must be holy as he is holy. They must show that difference. They must not be like the nations I'm driving out before you. That is Canaan and even Egypt. Now, what's in Leviticus 18? Well, it's mostly a whole run of prohibitions on various kinds of incest. But it also includes adultery, homosexuality, and bestiality that were typical, apparently, of the residents of the land, of the Canaanites. So Yahweh said, the nations I'm driving out before you have defiled themselves by all these things. They've committed all these abominations. And that's why Yahweh's judging them for it. You have to see that Canaanites were not happy, decent, God-fearing pagans doing the best they could, but they were degenerate, perverted. They were a sex-crazed culture that thought both its brains and its worship resided between their legs. And God was going to judge them. He has the right to judge that kind of iniquity. So the patience God shows, the depravity God abhors, and the third element of the Old Testament view of the conquest is the instrument God uses. Deuteronomy 9, verses 4 to 6. What's he say there? He says to Israel, when you go in to the land, don't think it's because of your righteousness that I'm giving you the land. It's because of the unrighteousness of the inhabitants. And he repeats that 2 or 3 times in Deuteronomy 9. Not because you're righteous, but because they're unrighteous, that I'm giving you the land. What's that mean? That means that God was bringing righteous judgment on unrighteous Canaanites, Leviticus 18, by means of unrighteous Israelites. God does that sometimes. He uses unrighteous people to bring his judgment on other unrighteous people. So on. That's what is happening. So you have to keep those three elements in mind. Now, does that make the conquest pretty? No. Does that make it sanitary? No. It only says, in the perspective of the Old Testament and God's right to judge people, it only says it's just. Okay. Now, that's not going to help your unbelieving friends, maybe, that can't stand the idea of God judging anyone. But that's the Old Testament view. Now, that's the dull stuff, okay? Now, number two, the big picture. The big picture. And for the big picture, you go to the super summary of chapter 21, verses 43 to 45. Let me just read that section there. Chapter 21, beginning at 43. Thus Yahweh gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it, and they settled there. And Yahweh gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies has withstood them, for Yahweh had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one word of all the good promises that Yahweh had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. About 6 alls or so there. That's the stress. Now, what you have there at the end of chapter 21, verses 43 to 45, is as if the writer has taken a thick black magic marker and wiped it across the page. This is the hinge of the book of Joshua. You say, why didn't it come earlier? Well, I don't know, but it comes here late in the book. So, what's that mean? Well, before in chapters 1 to 21, you have the record of God's faithfulness in giving Israel's victory and keeping hold of them through all their stupidity, etc. So the record of God's faithfulness, chapters 1 to 21. And then in chapters 22 to 24, you have the response of God's people, the response they're supposed to make to that faithfulness, especially in terms of first commandment-like obedience. Chapter 21, 43 to 45 is like Romans 11, 33 to 36. You remember when you get in Romans 11 and you get at the beginning of chapter 12, and Paul says, now in view of all the mercies of God, present your bodies a living sacrifice. That is, in response to all God's done for you, here's how you're to live. Here's how you respond to that in Romans 12 to 16. But what about those mercies of God? What's it mean by that? Well, that's all that he's described in Romans 1 to 11. And then at the end of Romans 11, he says, oh, how deep the depth and the riches and wisdom of God. And so on. And he goes into that doxology, summing up Romans 1 to 11. Well, that's very like Joshua 21, 43 to 45. You go through the mercies of God, the doxology, that's the hinge of the book of Romans, and then chapters 12 to 16 of Romans. Now, here's how you're to respond to those mercies of God. That's the same way in the book of Joshua. The record of God's faithfulness, first 21 chapters. Then this hinge point at the end of 21. And then how do you respond to that? So what he's saying is, in chapters 1 to 21, you need to stand and sing, great is thy faithfulness. And then in chapters 22 to 24, you need to sing, O Jesus, I have promised to serve thee to the end. That's the thrust. It's the same pattern, isn't it? Grace precedes our response. That's the big picture. Massive grace, proper response, the hinge at the end of chapter 21. Now, then, number 3, the primary testimony of Joshua. And here we have to just be very, just sum it up in a way. But if you take the major chunks of Joshua, you know that you have, it breaks up into about 4 broad divisions. The first is entering the land, chapters 1 to 4. Taking the land, chapters 5 to 12. Allotting the land among the tribes, that's 13 to 21. And then retaining the land, 22 to 24. You retain the land by being faithful to Yahweh and worshiping only Him. So on. So, entering, taking, allotting, and retaining the land. Well, that's the breakdown of what's happening, the contents of Joshua. But that doesn't tell us the testimony about Yahweh, about God. What's it telling us about our God? And so I want to break this down into those categories. So the first part of the testimony is that He is the God who overwhelms all obstacles, chapters 1 to 4. We might even include 6, the Jericho conquest. The God who overwhelms all obstacles, chapters 1 to 4. You notice that the book of Joshua begins with a funeral. Moses has died. Now, I don't know whether you can think about what that must have meant in Israel. If you go to the last paragraph of Deuteronomy 34, right before the book of Joshua opens, you hear, there was no one as great as Moses as a prophet in Israel, ever, and so on. And Moses, they would rebel against him. They made trouble for him, but there was no one like Moses with whom the Lord spoke mouth to mouth. And now Moses is, as we say in Mississippi, dead. There's a crisis. Now, does that stop anything? No. Notice in chapter 1, Yahweh says to Joshua, "Rise, cross over this Jordan." So, if the outstanding leader dies, does that cancel God's program? No. God's kingdom is not based on great men, but on great promises. And even though the servants die, God's plan and God's kingdom will go on. So even in the face of that funeral, and then you come to chapters 3 and 4, and there's this flooding river, which is probably a mile wide in the floodplain there where they're crossing it, not far off from Jericho. And it says in Joshua 3:15, now the Jordan, it's a beautiful thing. I can't go into it right now. It's just a little parenthesis, but it says the Jordan overflows all its banks all the time of harvest. It means barley harvest. It means in the spring when the waters are coming down from Mount Hermon and so on, and it's flooding over, and you have not only a wide river, but you have all this jungle gunk in it and so on as well to have to get through that. How on earth are they ever going to get into the land? And why? Why on earth does Yahweh take them in at the time when it's most impossible to get through that stuff? Why does He make the decisions He does? But He's a God who overwhelms all obstacles, and even raging rivers, and even the fortress in Jericho, chapter 6, who's completely shut up. No one went in or without. But But that was taken care of. The wall didn't fall down flat, as you sometimes envision, but it says the wall fell down in its place. That is, there were places in the wall where it was apparently taken up from the bottom of it. It created crevices and broke up and so on, and Israel were able to go in and attack. But there's nothing that stops His kingdom plan and work. No matter what the obstacles are, Yahweh overcomes them. That's the testimony. Sometimes it's helpful to see that in terms of a human situation of someone's determination to have their own way, and they will get it. Back in 1745, there was a pastor in Scotland by the name of Aeneas Sage. Now, this would have been before our Revolutionary War, 1745. And Aeneas Sage went to a certain village, I forget which one it was. He was to be the pastor there. And the people really didn't want to come to church. They didn't want to worship on the Sabbath day. They wanted to play games, etc., on the village green and all of that sort of stuff. Well, Pastor Sage decided he was going to change that. Now, he was a rather forbidding presence. He was pretty muscular. So he challenged the local wrestling champ by the name of Big Rory to a contest. Well, he threw Big Rory, defeated him, and Big Rory became Pastor Sage's fast friend. Well, Aeneas Sage said to Big Rory a plan he had to fill the church. So the Sabbath day came, people were out playing their games, and Aeneas Sage and Rory both went out, and each of them grabbed 2 men, and they dragged them into the church, threw them in, and locked the door. Then they both went out, and they did the same thing again. They were tough guys, and they grabbed a couple of fellows each, and they took them up, threw them in, and they locked the door. Well, after a while, you get the church filled. And then it said Pastor Sage went up into the pulpit and conducted service while Big Rory stood at the back of the church with a club in his hand. And it was said that Pastor Sage made the people very orthodox. I don't know in heart or not, but apparently some of that. But you see, that's the point. I'm going to have a congregation here, and I'm going to see that it's done, and nothing's going to stop me from having it. Now, that's the sense you need to get with the God who overwhelms all obstacles. He's going to bring his plans to pass for his people, and nothing's going to stop him. Now, there's a second emphasis in the testimony, and that is the God who fights for his people, chapters 5 to 12. The God who fights for his people. Now, you see this intervention of Yahweh on behalf of Israel in their battles. And this is a thing, because this is the violence aspect and so on, that sometimes disturbs people. We've tried to deal with a little bit of that in our comments about the morality of the conquest. But you see Yahweh's active intervention in battle for his people. You see it in chapter 6 when he breaks up Jericho, so that the walls, so that Israel can go in. You see it in chapter 8 when he tells Joshua and Israel how they can proceed with Ai, how they can proceed in conquering Ai. You see it in chapter 10 when he intervenes with great hailstones on some of the people in that southern coalition that came against Israel. You see it in chapter 11 when in the first 5 verses you have this massive buildup of a northern coalition against Israel to attack them and so on, and Yahweh gives them into the hand of Israel. So the God who fights for his people. We may not like that emphasis so much, but I think it's what really is our comfort ultimately. That's a theme that Scripture keeps pressing on us. Remember Psalm 24, verse 8. Who is the King of glory? Yahweh, strong and mighty. Yahweh, mighty in battle. Are you going to be ashamed of that? Now, there's this sense of Yahweh as the warrior who fights and takes up the cudgels for his people throughout Scripture, so that in Revelation 19, when you have the second coming of Christ depicted, he's on a white horse with his name Faithful and True, coming to put down their enemies, isn't he? So this is a warrior. This is something that needs to be taken to heart for our own comfort. Maybe we see it more when it comes down to maybe a personal level. I remember one time when I was in 8th grade. I must have been about 13. We looked forward every summer to the Sunday school picnic that our little church had in western Pennsylvania. We went over 5 miles. You may have heard of Grove City College. Well, Grove City, Pennsylvania had a very nice city park, and we would go there and have our Sunday school picnic. And you had watermelon and all the sort of gooey stuff that kids love, and we enjoyed it. And one time I saw, as we were sitting there eating, going past the shelter, there was a kid. He must have been about 18, and he had a T-shirt on, white T-shirt, and rolled up in the sleeve of his T-shirt was a pack of Winstons. I thought, now that kid's pretty imposing. Well, it turned out he was apparently with another church also having a picnic, and our two churches decided to play each other in a softball game later. So I was playing first base for our team, and here comes Mr. Winston up to bat for the other team. And he hits a single, not a home run, just a single. Well, he rounds first base, and I'm there, and he said something like, you better watch it if I have to come back into the base. Kind of a threat. I'm 13 years old, I'm an 8th grader. What's this big oaf thinks he has to do? And so on. I kind of intimidated. Well, we go in after we get them out, and my brother, next older brother, Jim, was 8 years older than I was. He was about 21, and he was just watching the game. He came over to me and he said, you know, if that guy bothers you anymore, you just tell him to come see me. Now, that made a whole difference in my attitude the rest of that game. I felt, well, liberated. He didn't say to me, you know, Ralph, I remember times when I was bullied, and I know what you're going through, and it's a tough... No, he said, you tell him to come see me. And my father, who was a Presbyterian minister, but who was known sometimes to be a little earthy in his comments, said later when I told him about it, well, Jim would have beaten the slop out of him. Well, that's the kind of brother you need to have. But there's a sense of this. You have to get this, the God who fights for his people. He is the Lord, mighty in battle. And if we lose that, we've lost an element of Joshua faith. Now, number three, in terms of testimony, the God who stirs up fading zeal. The God who stirs up fading zeal. Now, this is in chapters 13 to 21. You notice that this is where it's the not so exciting part of Joshua begins, the allotting the land. Chapter 13:1 begins, and there remains yet very much land to possess. Now, by that it means that they conquered a lot, they had taken a lot, but when they take or capture towns, those original inhabitants sometimes could filter back and so on. So there's a difference between taking the land, the weakening of the Canaanite power. You notice at the end of chapter 12, or chapter 10 a couple of times, Israel had been in an extensive campaign in the south. And they'd taken a lot of towns. Then they go back to Gilgal. Where is Gilgal? It's down by the Jericho, down by the Jordan River. It was their first camp. They weren't trying to occupy the land at that point. They were taking it. They were breaking the back of Canaanite power. Then they went back to their camp. But when the tribes were allotted their various inheritances and sections, then they were to go in and completely clean up the land, drive the inhabitants out. They were then to possess the land. So there's a difference between taking and possessing. And there's a lot of land yet to possess, and the individual tribes were charged with doing this ongoing work. And there was a fading zeal coming into place. Now, if you look at chapters 14 to 17, and you probably don't want to do that in your devotional reading maybe, but if you look at chapters 14 to 17, you'll notice that a good bit of that chapter 15 talks about all these towns in Judah that were the inheritance of the tribe of Judah. And chapter 16 and most of 17 talks about the territories and the borders and some of the towns in the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh. But at the beginning of that section and at the end, you have two different attitudes toward this whole thing. In chapter 14, verses 6 to 15, that's before you get to all the towns in Judah and so on. In chapter 14, verses 6 to 14, you have this little interlude of Caleb the believer, who says to Joshua, Chapter 14, verse 12, give me this hill country around Hebron, which Yahweh spoke on that day, for you've heard on that day how the Anakim were there with great fortified cities. It may be that Yahweh will be with me, and I shall drive them out, just as Yahweh had said. The guy's 85 years old. He says, I'm still strong enough for this. Give it to me. Let me see what Yahweh will do. See that attitude of faith. Now, that's at the beginning of this section. Then you go through the towns of Judah, and then you go through the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, and then at the end of chapter 17, you have a completely opposite attitude. The Joseph tribes, we're a numerous people, Joshua. You need to give us more territory to possess. He says, well, clean it out for yourselves. Go up in the hill country but the Canaanites in the valleys, they have chariots of iron. We have to whine. We have to whimper. We can't do it. You have this positive attitude of faith on Caleb's part. You have this attitude of whining on the Joseph tribe's part. The writer is trying to tell you something. There are two attitudes here toward this matter of possessing the land. And there is a danger of fading zeal on the part of God's people. And you see that when you come into chapter 18, especially verse 3. There, the situation in chapter 18, you have, it's at Shiloh. That's where the tabernacle is. And there are 7 tribes who have not yet received or taken control of their inheritance. And so Joshua has them write up a description of the land remaining, and he assigns them the territory they're to have. But here they are at Shiloh, and they're not doing anything. Chapter 18, verse 3, Yahweh says to Israel, how long will you keep on letting yourselves let things go? My translation. How long will you keep on letting yourselves let things go? These 7 tribes, in other words, to put it bluntly, are to get off their duff and follow up on the conquest and the progress that has been made. It's the hard dog work of nailing down their possessions, of following up the initial victories, and they're not doing it. They're sitting still. And isn't that, I know it's a big transition now, isn't that, though, a problem that's always the case? That sometimes it's the ongoing, gritty, determined persistence that's the hardest to do, even in the Christian life. Here, God is trying to stir up his people to the non-spectacular task of ongoing obedience. That's always the hard part. Martin Lloyd-Jones was in his pastorate in Wales, his first pastorate, and there was a fellow in his congregation by the name of I.B., initials, I.B. Davies. And he was in the mines and so on, the coal mines and that sort of thing. But as he attended congregation, he felt the Lord leading him into the ministry. And he finally mentioned this to Lloyd-Jones. And, when you have somebody like that who thinks, I feel the Lord may be calling me to the ministry, there's a temptation to say something like, okay, let's see if we can get you into, why don't you speak to our men's group? Or why don't you give your testimony at the meeting at the jail every 2 weeks? Or now, why don't you work with our youth? Or something like that. Well, Lloyd-Jones didn't say that. He said, go home and study Greek. That's all. A year later, Mr. Davies is coming out of a church one evening, and he had a book in his back pocket, and Lloyd-Jones asked him what it was. He pulled it out. It was a Greek grammar. He'd been doing exactly what his pastor told him to do. If you think you might be headed to the ministry, then do the dirty dog work that you have to do in order to prepare for expounding the Word of God. Go home and study Greek. And if you do that, that will show something about you. And it's that doing the non-spectacular stuff of slogging obedience in the Christian life when there aren't necessarily exciting and spectacular things happening all the time. that sometimes is the most difficult. So the God who stirs up fading zeal. Let me press on one other on you. The fourth element of testimony, Yahweh is the God who demands ongoing fidelity. Chapters 22 to 24. The God who demands ongoing fidelity. Now, chapter 22, verse 5 highlights this response. When Yahweh says, or Joshua says to Israel, only be very careful to observe the commandment and the law that Moses, the servant of Yahweh, commanded you, to love Yahweh your God, and to walk in all his ways, and to keep his commandments, and to cling to him, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. All Yahweh wants is everything you've got. Simple. Now that's the stress throughout chapters 22 to 24. I could run you through the text with it, but I can't do that this morning. That's the stress. The God who demands ongoing fidelity. That's the response Yahweh wants. Reader's Digest once had a incident in it of a young woman who worked in an office and had apparently had some time off to have a baby. Now, she brought the baby into the office so that her associates could ooh and awe over the baby, and she brought with her her 7-year-old son as well. So while they were there showing off the baby and so on, the 7-year-old son said to his mother, "Mommy, can I have some money so that I can buy a soda?" She said to him, "What do you say?" And he said, "You're thin and beautiful." And she gave him the money. That was the response she wanted. Not please, you're thin and beautiful. That's the right response. Chapter 22, verse 5, etc., is the response Yahweh wants from Israel. That's what he's looking for. Now, that's what Israel gave. In chapter 24, verses 16 to 18, after Joshua gave that ringing cry, "As for me and my house, we'll serve Yahweh," then the Israelites came out with just the ideal confession of faith and assertion of loyalty to Yahweh alone. And what does Joshua do? He turns into the anti-evangelist in 24:19, and he said, "You cannot serve Yahweh. Do you realize what a kind of a God he is, a holy and jealous God? And if you commit apostasy, that is, if you turn, not if you commit sins, etc., but if you turn away from him, he'll destroy you." And so it's as if in verse 19, Joshua negates almost everything he's trying to get the right response from Israel. They give him technically the right response, and he says, you can't serve Yahweh. It's as if Joshua says, "I don't care what Billy Graham says. Take the decision card home, don't fill it out. Take it home, put it as a blank on your kitchen table. Think through this before you fill that thing out. I know Billy says that if you came with a bus or a group, the bus will wait." No, it won't. You need to get on that bus or you'll miss your ride home. Think about what you're doing. That's a pretty solemn affair. Don't make half-baked, emotional, teary-eyed commitments. It was A.W. Tozer of the Christian Missionary Alliance who, on one occasion, preached a powerful Sunday evening message. And Tozer then told the congregation, "It would be easy for me to have the front filled with an invitation, right? But I'm afraid I would do it in the flesh. I'm going to ask you not to talk as you leave the service, and just go home. Go to your bedrooms, go to your living rooms, get the passage of Scripture out and say, 'God, what are you saying to me?'" That's what you should do with the book of Joshua. "God, what are you saying to me?" Thank you, O Lord our God, for stooping down and speaking to us in words like a book like this, and for the testimony that you leave in your wake. May it both shake us and may it comfort us, because you are our God. In Jesus' name, amen. Ah.